The sound of artillery fire is often the first thing we associate with war, the thunderous boom that shatters the silence of history and redraws the maps of nations. Yet beneath the smoke and the chaos lies a quieter, more insidious rhythm that dictates the true outcome of every conflict. It is the sound of printing presses spinning in the dead of night, the scratching of pen nibs on bond certificates, and the silent electronic transfer of reserves between central banks that ultimately determines who fights, who dies, and who profits when the smoke clears. While history books record the dates of battles and the names of generals, they often obscure the financial engines that made those battles possible, hiding the reality that modern warfare is not merely a contest of military might, but a competition of creditworthiness and debt sustainability. When we peel back the layers of geopolitical strategy, we find that the most powerful weapon in any empire's arsenal is not the missile or the tank, but the ability to borrow money against the future productivity of its citizens to fund destruction in the present. This hidden mechanism transforms war from a political failure into a financial necessity, creating a cycle where debt accumulation leads to conflict, and conflict leads to further debt, trapping nations in a spiral that only ends when the currency itself collapses under the weight of its own promises. We are living in an era where this cycle is accelerating with terrifying speed as global debt levels reach historic highs, while geopolitical tensions fracture the stable order that has existed since the end of the Cold War. The stakes have never been higher because the financial systems that once absorbed the shock of wartime spending are now stretched to their breaking point, leaving major powers with fewer options than they realize. When a government can no longer borrow cheaply to fund its military ambitions, it faces a stark choice between defaulting on its obligations or inflating away its debt through currency debasement, both of which carry catastrophic consequences for the average citizen. Understanding this dynamic is not merely an academic exercise for economists, but a crucial survival skill for anyone navigating the coming decades, as the hidden debt cycles behind every war suggest that the conflicts we see on the news are merely symptoms of a deeper monetary disease. The urgency of this moment lies in the fact that the mechanisms which sustained empires for centuries are failing simultaneously across the globe, creating a volatile environment where a single miscalculation in bond markets could trigger a chain reaction of military escalation. To understand where we are going, we must rewind to the origins of modern war finance, looking back to the Napoleonic Wars, where the true nature of debt-funded conflict was first revealed on a global scale. It was during this period that the House of Rothschild and the Bank of England perfected the art of using sovereign debt to outlast an enemy, proving that a nation with a robust credit market could defeat a nation with a superior army simply by sustaining the cost of war for longer. The British government issued consols, perpetual bonds that promised interest forever without a maturity date, allowing them to pool the capital of the entire merchant class to fund the coalition against France. Meanwhile, Napoleon relied on plunder and metallic currency, a system that collapsed when the flow of gold from conquered territories slowed, demonstrating that even the greatest military genius is helpless against the mathematics of compound interest. This historical parallel establishes the first rule of geopolitical finance. Empires that can monetize their future survival through debt will always outlast empires that rely on immediate resources, setting a precedent that would define the next 200 years of human conflict. The narrative deepens as we move into the 20th century, where the scale of destruction required a corresponding evolution in financial engineering, culminating in the First World War, which was effectively paid for by the populations of Europe through invisible inflation taxes. When the war began in 1914, most nations suspended the gold standard, recognizing that a strict metallic backing would limit their ability to print the money needed for munitions and soldiers. Governments issued war bonds with patriotic fervor, convincing citizens to lend their savings to the state with the promise of repayment after victory. But the reality was that the money supply had expanded so drastically that the currency returned after the war was worth a fraction of its former value. The Weimar Republic in Germany serves as the most extreme example of this mechanism, where the inability to pay reparations debt led to the printing of marks until the currency became worthless, destroying the middle class and creating the social conditions that would lead to the next global conflict. This was not an accident of policy, but a structural inevitability of trying to fund unlimited warfare with limited resources, a lesson that was learned but never truly internalized by the architects of the future global order. Following the devastation of the Second World War, the Allies gathered at Bretton Woods to design a system that would prevent such economic chaos from recurring, establishing the US dollar as the global reserve currency backed by gold. This arrangement created a new hierarchy of debt where the United States could run deficits to fund its global military presence, while other nations accumulated dollars as reserves, effectively lending money to Washington in exchange for security guarantees. The Vietnam War became the stress test for this system, as massive military spending without corresponding tax increases led to inflationary pressures that eventually forced President Nixon to close the gold window in 1971. This moment marked the transition to a fiat currency regime where money was no longer backed by physical assets, but by the trust in the government's ability to manage its debt, unleashing a new era where war could be funded indefinitely without the constraint of gold reserves. The petrodollar system that emerged shortly after ensured that oil, the lifeblood of industrial economies, had to be purchased in dollars, creating artificial demand for U.S. debt and allowing the American empire to export its inflation to the rest of the world. The mechanism behind this cycle is rooted in the concept of Seigniorage and the monopoly on violence held by the state, which allows governments to create money out of thin air to purchase real resources for military use. When a government decides to go to war, it does not typically raise taxes immediately because doing so is politically unpopular and economically contractionary. So instead, it issues bonds that are purchased by the central bank or commercial banks. This process injects new liquidity into the economy, bidding up the prices of steel, oil, and labor, which leads to inflation that acts as a hidden tax on everyone holding the currency. The real resources are transferred from the private sector to the military-industrial complex, while the cost is deferred into the future through debt obligations that may never be fully repaid in real terms. Interest rates play a crucial role in this dynamic, as low rates allow governments to roll over debt indefinitely. But when inflation rises and central banks are forced to hike rates, the cost of servicing the debt can consume the entire budget, forcing austerity or further monetary expansion. This feedback loop creates a situation where the financial system becomes dependent on continuous growth and stability, making any disruption to the global order an existential threat to the currency itself. Today, we see the same historical forces repeating with alarming clarity as major powers engage in proxy conflicts and economic sanctions that function as modern forms of warfare without the declaration of war. The sanctions imposed on Russia following the invasion of Ukraine were not merely political statements, but financial weapons designed to freeze assets and cut off access to the SWIFT banking system, effectively weaponizing the global debt network against a sovereign nation. In response, nations around the world began to realize the vulnerability of holding reserves in currencies that could be seized by geopolitical rivals, accelerating the trend toward de-dollarization and the accumulation of gold by central banks in the global south. This shift represents a fundamental crack in the Bretton Woods II system, as the trust required to sustain fiat debt cycles is eroding among the very nations that provide the surplus capital needed to fund American deficits. At the same time, the United States faces its own debt sustainability crisis, with interest payments on the national debt surpassing the defense budget, creating a paradox where the cost of maintaining the empire threatens to bankrupt the empire itself. The hidden forces driving these trends are not shadowy conspirators, but institutional incentives embedded within the structure of central banking and government finance. The Federal Reserve, the European Central Bank, and the People's Bank of China are all tasked with maintaining stability in their respective jurisdictions, but their tools are limited to manipulating interest rates and money supply, which often exacerbates the underlying imbalances. Commercial banks and institutional investors are compelled to hold government debt as risk-free assets, creating a captive audience for sovereign borrowing that allows deficits to grow without immediate market discipline. The military-industrial complex lobbies for continued spending, not only for strategic reasons, but because their business models depend on the continuous flow of government contracts funded by debt. These institutions are not acting with malice, but are following the logical path of least resistance within a system that rewards short-term stability over long-term solvency, creating a collective action problem where no single actor can stop the cycle without triggering a collapse. The incentives are aligned toward kicking the can down the road, using financial engineering to delay the reckoning until the options are exhausted. As we move deeper into this acceleration phase, the data suggests that the window for a soft landing is closing rapidly as debt to GDP ratios across the developed world reach levels previously seen only during total war. Historical precedents from the British Empire in the 19th century to the Japanese Empire in the 20th century show that when debt service costs exceed a certain threshold, nations are forced to choose between financial repression, default, or external conflict to reset the balance sheet. We are seeing early signs of financial repression today, where central banks keep interest rates below inflation to erode the real value of debt, silently transferring wealth from savers to borrowers, including the government. However, this strategy requires a compliant population and a controlled financial system, conditions that are becoming harder to maintain as inflation impacts the cost of living and political polarization increases. The acceleration is also visible in the speed of capital flight and currency volatility, As markets begin to price in the risk of sovereign debt crises that could spill over into military confrontations over resources, the precedent of the 1930s looms large, where competitive devaluations and trade barriers contributed to the breakdown of global cooperation, suggesting that the economic warfare of today could easily transition into kinetic warfare tomorrow. The climax of this narrative arrives at the realization that war is not an interruption of the economic system, but a feature of it, serving as a mechanism to destroy excess debt and reset the valuation of assets through physical destruction and inflation. When debt levels become unsustainable, a conflict can provide the justification for massive monetary expansion and the restructuring of obligations under the guise of national emergency. The big truth that must be understood is that the stability we have enjoyed for the past few decades was not a natural state of affairs, but a temporary equilibrium, maintained by the dominance of a single reserve currency and the willingness of surplus nations to fund the deficits of the consumer nations. As that dominance fades and the willingness to fund those deficits evaporates, the hidden debt cycles that were suppressed will reassert themselves with violent force, demanding a rebalancing that cannot be achieved through policy alone. The revelation is that the money in your bank account is a claim on future production that has already been spent on past conflicts, and the value of that claim depends entirely on the ability of the state to enforce its validity through power. When that power is challenged, the debt cycle completes its loop, and the currency returns to its intrinsic value, which is often zero. In the end, the history of money is the history of war, and the history of war is the history of debt, forming a triad that defines the rise and fall of every great empire throughout recorded time. We stand at a juncture where the patterns of the past are converging with the complexities of the modern financial system, creating a scenario where the outcome is uncertain, but the direction is clear. The reflective truth is that individuals cannot stop these cycles, but they can understand them, positioning themselves to withstand the turbulence that comes when the hidden mechanisms of debt-fueled conflict are exposed to the light of day. The ending of this story is not written yet, but the chapters of history suggest that those who recognize the nature of the game will be better prepared for the inevitable shift than those who believe the current system is permanent. The silence of the printing press is louder than the roar of the cannon, and it is in that silence that the future of our wealth and our freedom is being decided, waiting for the next cycle to begin as the old one finally collapses under its own weight. If you found this video useful, please subscribe to the channel and give it a like.